Welcome along to another episode of the Monday Review. I think we're on episode 8 or 9 now. I'm slightly losing track. Following on from weekend racing where the focus was on Newbury in the UK and Fairyhouse in Ireland, both of which did well to beat the weather. Unfortunately, Newcastle went by the wayside, but the Fighting Fifth has been rescheduled for Sandown on Saturday, which looks like having an absolute bumper card. And let's just hope that the weather is a little bit more kind next weekend. So the Monday Review looks back at the weekend's racing, and it's just my views, my opinions on what's shaping my thinking from the weekend heading forward into the rest of the season. So Friday, I suppose, there's only 1 point to start, and that is the birth of a new superstar in Jeriko du Reponet. Kudos to the Racing Post marketing and social media team, who I'm sure knew exactly what they were doing, throwing that fishing line out there. And well done to all of you that bit, slightly myself included. Jeriko du Reponet was well talked of before. He'd done a nice piece of work at Newbury Gallop morning. Although quite what you can gauge by that, I don't know when he was working upside a 3-mile chaser. Was sent off a short price here. Nicky Henderson has sort of not hidden his regard he holds the horse in, says he's everything you would want in a horse. And he looked really smart. You know, he travelled through the race well, he jumped well, went through a gap when needed, so he's clearly got a bit of heart and quickened away and won an impressive style. But what's the form worth? No one knows. King William Rufus was second. He was 40-1. He was beaten 36 lengths by Willmount, albeit on his hurdling debut, so he's going to have come forward a bit for the experience and a little bit for fitness. But is he going to have improved 30-something lengths? I'm not so sure. And then Sea Invasion was 25 lengths behind Cannock Park at Cheltenham, and he was also from Chris Gordon Yard. So there's no real form line there. You just have to trust your eye. He looks smart. He went through the race very nicely. He wasn't mad keen. He finished his race off well, and he jumped well. But the time was slower than the juvenile hurdle, I believe. So as yet, we can't quite call him a superstar. And I am just reminded of Jet Powered, who from the same yard won in equally impressive fashion this time last year and then bombed out badly on his next start. He actually returned at Newbury on Saturday, and I did chance him. I thought he was quite well handicapped off 131, and he failed to fire again. So it is just a timely reminder, if you're feeling tempted to take a price of 3 or 4 to 1. I mean, A, go and see your doctor, and B, just remember that, you know, Jet Powered was equally impressive this time last year and has sort of failed to build on that. That is the nature of young horses, unfortunately. But he's a smart prospect, and it's nice to have one of the smart hurdling prospects housed in the UK. If you're one of these people that get very wound up between the Presbury Cup and the battle between the UK and Ireland come Cheltenham. So smart horse, but let's just cool our jets a little, I think. The John Francombe Novice Chase saw the return of Hermes Allen and his seasonal return, his first start over fences, and he was very impressive. He jumped well, his jumping warmed up as he went through. And given that the vibes coming out of the yard beforehand and in interviews at the track beforehand were that he was going to come forward significantly for the run, I think he did very well to pick up Nickle Back and run right away from him ultimately. I think this suggests that he might well head out in trip. I think the further he went, the better he went. Jumped very efficiently. Like I said, he's got a great teacher in Harry Cobham on his back. No finer man for a novice chaser in the UK as far as I'm concerned. And there's absolutely nothing to like. He's just simply not a horse I've ever warmed to. I didn't warm to him last year. I thought he was beating trees essentially, and I felt kind of justified when he bombed out at the back end of the year. But he's had a wind up over the summer, so that might explain those subpar runs later in the back end of last season. But I'm yet to get on the Hermes Allen bandwagon. If you are on the Hermes Allen bandwagon, as a good friend of mine, Andrew, is, you'll be delighted to know that I wasn't on the bandwagon for Stage Start or Brave Man's Game either. So it might just be that I have a blind spot when it comes to these highly touted Paul Nicholls hurdlers going chasing. So perfectly impressive, but for me, not quite on the bandwagon just yet. Nickle Back, I thought, ran a really good race back in second. I was slightly disappointed by the ride James Best gave, and I say this with the utmost respect for any jockey that goes out and does what they do day in, day out. But I thought Nickle Back made a couple of mistakes that were perhaps down to James Best not being quite as brave as Nickle Back. Now, maybe that's James Best knowing that Nickle Back is trying to cash checks that his body can't cash, but I'm not so sure. I think this horse got loads of scope, and I'd be really interested to see him under a sort of full-blooded, brave ride. Just let him rip and see what he can do, and maybe even come back in trip. I'm certain he's a very smart animal, and I just think maybe James Best trying to temper his enthusiasm and organise him ultimately worked against them. But Hermes Allen was impressive. Nickle Back, I'm not giving up on him yet. I'm sure he's got a big pot in him yet. Moving on then on the Friday, the final race of the day really of interest was the long distance hurdle. Not a huge amount to say about this in terms of form lines going forward, but just if you watched this and couldn't get your heart rate up and couldn't get involved, this perhaps isn't the sport for you, because two old warriors, Dashel Drasher, Paisley Park, hammer and tongs to the finish. Dashel Drasher just poking his nose out at the right time to sort of prevail from a fast finishing Paisley Park, who at 11 years of age still looks like he's got plenty of desire for the racing game just yet. It's not a race really that you would anticipate shaking up the stayers hurdle market going forwards, but it does just highlight what a weak division this is. I actually penned an anti-post piece that will be up for SBK earlier, well, this morning actually, and sort of suggested that it's a market that's rife for an upset. There's certainly room for an outsider to come from somewhere and stake their claim, because there is no standout in this division, and there hasn't been for some years really. But Dashel Drasher, Paisley Park, absolutely brilliant to watch, but I don't think they're going to be taking high honours later in the season. Moving on to Saturday, and I think we ought to start with the Sir Peter O'Sullivan chase, where Inch House looked really impressive. He was sent off a very short price, price I saw in the morning. I was keen to try and find something to oppose him with. Actually couldn't, but was quite happy to sit on my hands at 6-4, I think he was. But he won as a 6-4 shot, travelled well, jumped really well, was very good in his jumping up the home straight, and cleared right away in the closing stages. That's over 2 miles 6. He did finish his hurdling career last year, winning over 2 miles 7 and a bit at Chepstow. So he's clearly going to stay further, and he might just be one that John will keep to the minimum, well, not the minimum trip, but Inch House's minimum trip of 2.5 miles, maybe a little bit more, until the spring, and then look to up him in trip to 3 miles. They had obviously had Monbeg Genius go very close in the Ultima last year. And this horse looks in a similar mould, might just be a little bit more adaptable with regards to ground than Monbeg Genius, which we'll come on to in a minute. But he does also pay a handsome compliment to Chianti Classico, who kicked him out the way at Chepstow. Inch House as well, putting his place on that occasion. Could well be that he's taken a big step forward for fitness and experience, which I'm sure he has, but there's no reason to say Chianti Classico hasn't either. So two smart chasers there, tying in on form lines, Inch House, and paying a compliment to Chianti Classico, who you know I've spoken plenty about. The big race of the day down at Newbury was the Cold Gold Trophy, and it was a good day for the handicap movers and shakers and the SBK podcast, actually, as Datsalrightgino bolted in really, and Gavin Sheehan, who'd rerouted from Newcastle at 16-1. I think it was a good decision really, that or a good stroke of luck that Gavin Sheehan was able to reroute from Newcastle. I'm not sure Tom Cannon would have had perhaps the knowledge of the horse to deliver the ride that Gavin gave. That's right, Gino was very patiently ridden. I mean, was stone cold last going down the back, and actually, having tipped 2 up on the SBK podcast, also tipped up Our Power, it was him I was more focusing on. And then when he departed halfway down the back, I sort of slightly thought my chance of finding a winner for the podcast had gone, and looked back and wasn't sure how well Datsalrightgino was going. He was sort of on a long rein and niggling away a little bit, but turning across the top, he came alive past the bypassed cross fence. And I started to really get quite hopeful then, because I was pretty confident he'd improve for the step up to 3. And the way he travelled up the home straight, it was just a case of negotiating the fences and kicking away and using his better speed on this good ground, which is so essential to Datsalrightgino. I mean, he's pretty much a horse that if the going description is soft, it wouldn't matter what race he was running in, you could just put a line through him. He can't operate on it. But he kicked away from Mahler Mission, who ran a really good race, especially considering that John McConnell's had a pretty tough time with the form of his yard. Mahler Mission just stayed on at the one pace, whereas Datsalrightgino had a little bit of a class angle maybe, and at a better turn of foot, and sprinted away from him. Mahler Mission has certainly got a handicap in him, provided the handicapper doesn't go too wild with his mark tomorrow. Back in third was Monbeg Genius, who I thought was just inconvenienced by the quick ground. His jumping was scrappy, but it just, to me, looked like it was all just happening a little bit too quick. And we know that he's up to this class because he was a good third in the Ultima at Cheltenham last season. So I think a little bit of softer ground will see him to better effect. I've seen he's now been put in as virtually favourite for the Welsh National. I just wonder whether they'll wait and try and keep him over 3 miles on softer ground before they start stretching him out in trip on potentially softer ground. But Monbeg Genius lost nothing in defeat really on ground that I think was too lively. That was the UK action on Saturday, and then moving over to Fairyhouse on Saturday, where Corbetts Cross put the value of experience that he had from Nace to good effect and won his beginner's chase at Fairyhouse. Probably quite a decent beginner's chase. He got the better of 3-card Bragg and Nick Rocket, who'd been quietly spoken about in the Willie Mullins stable tour, and certainly Patrick Mullins had given him quite a big shout out on a couple of podcasts last week. But I thought Corbetts Cross improved as he went about his business. I thought his jumping was slicker than it was on debut, and he ultimately outstayed them over this 2 mile, 5.5 furlong trip. Suggests that he's going to improve further for 3 miles. Again, I don't think Emmett Mullins will be in a hurry to step him up. I'm sure he'll want to try and keep it a little bit under the bonnet until the spring. And I've got no reason to sort of turn away from this horse. I was keen on him at the back end of last year for the Brown Advisory. I still think that looks a very realistic target, and I was happy with what I saw from Corbetts Cross in the beginner's chase. The novice hurdle saw Ballyburn and Firefox face off in somewhat of an upset. Firefox defeated Ballyburn, but they were pretty closely matched in the market. Firefox had decent bumper form, had already had the advantage of a hurdle run, so he had fitness on his side and a bit of experience. I don't think Ballyburn did an awful lot wrong. You maybe might look at it and think that Willie's suggestion that he's not a horse that's short of pace and could be a horse for the Supreme might be that actually he does want a little bit further, but he's bound to come forward to this. A lot of Willies have been needing their first run. He wasn't knocked around by Paul Townend to win this, and if you're a Ballyburn fan, don't lose the faith. I'm sure he's a decent prospect. The Sunday action then brought into another novice hurdle, the Royal Bond, which was won by Farren Glory. I think this is largely a race that won't play a huge amount of part of my thinking going forward. I thought it was pretty weak race for the grade. King of Kingsfield came there swinging along, travelling as he does, and again just didn't find all that much off the bridle. Whether he needs his wind looking out or whether he is just a bit of a weak finisher, I don't know, but he was a bit disappointing. The other disappointment maybe was Encanto Bruno. Second time now he's disappointed on soft ground, the other time being at the Cheltenham Festival bumper last year. So it could just be that he doesn't like soft ground. His dam was certainly a good fast ground performer on the flat, though he has got a half brother by Mahler who has won on soft ground over 3 miles. But they're all different, and he might just want a little bit of better ground. The one thing that struck me about him is he did look very small up against these, and that made me just wonder that if he gets into a big field race come the festivals, whether he's going to be quite robust enough to cope with it. Surmising those novice hurdles, so the Ballyburn Firefox race and the Royal Bond, and then throwing in obviously Jeriko du Reponet, I do think that this year perhaps the depth of novice hurdlers certainly sits in Ireland, but the talent might be quite evenly balanced. You know, Nicky Henderson, who's largely the source for top UK novice hurdlers, has got Will Mount and Jeriko du Reponet, as well as a couple of others. He had Jinko Blue win at Newbury on Saturday. And it might just be that disparity between the UK hurdlers and the novice hurdlers and the Irish novice hurdlers is not as wide as it has been in previous years. The novice chasers, I think, certainly the strength in depth sits with Ireland. I don't see any of the UK novice chasers so far that I would consider being able to shake up the Irish novice chasers in graded contests, which brings us on to the Drinmore, where Am Maximus put to good use his experience really from winning the Irish Grand National last year. He was a second Stephen novice. I think he's now out of novice company as of this morning. It was his last chance to run a novice race. Good bit of placing by Willie and the JP team, and just essentially outstayed a fairly moderate field, I felt, for the Drinmore. Sharjah was perhaps the disappointing one. he maybe didn't enjoy the ground, and Gavin Cromwell's charge I just think was perhaps found wanting at this level. You know, he's got a fairly moderate is harsh, but he's not got a superstar rating. He's only in the 140s, and I think he probably ran to that and showed that that's about where he's at. So the Drinmore, again, probably quite a disappointing race. Willie is yet to wheel out his real big guns at this time of year. December into January is the time he's going to get going. So Sharjah was a disappointment. Am Maximus a good bit of placing, but the Drinmore I think won't be one of the novice races we look back at the end of the year and say, wow, look what this threw up. And then the final race I want to talk about this week is the Hatton's Grace, where Teahupoo downed Impaire Pass on his seasonal return for both these horses. But I think it's interesting that Teahupoo has now been spoken about, that he's going to be completely rested until the Cheltenham Festival and go towards the Stayers, whereas Impaire Pass, I imagine, is going to go on to maybe Leopardstown at Christmas, might come a little bit quickly, but almost certainly the Dublin Racing Festival, maybe a race in between now and the Dublin Race Festival if he doesn't go to Leopardstown at Christmas. I saw a lot of criticism of Paul Townend for being weak on Impaire Pass. And my opinion on that is simply that if you're holding that opinion, you are showing some naivety as to how these big yards operate. Impaire Pass has one big target, and that is the Champion Hurdle in March. And everything before then is building towards it. Whereas Teahupoo, they know that they could have him red hot fit and then let him down. Excuse Tom Cruise going overhead. Let him down and then bring him back for peak fitness in March. It is a commonly held consensus now in racehorse trainers' minds that they can only peak a horse a couple of times a season. Now, the whys and wherefores of that, and why Arkle was able to run such a high level so consistently is a conversation for another day, and probably for people that were around in the generation of Arkle, but that's the way they tend to do it now, is they peak them for one, maybe two targets every year, and everything around that is building towards those targets. So Paul Town was clearly at pains not to give Impaire Pass a hard race, not to absolutely bottom him out on this first start, over a trip that probably stretches his stamina. I think they found out that he's probably a horse that wants to come back in trip to the 2 miles. And to my mind, he lost absolutely nothing in defeat to a pretty solid yardstick. Now, as for the Stayers Hurdle, Teahupoo wasn't good enough last year when pretty much given his ultimate conditions. I did see that Jack Hendy said he felt like a stronger horse this year, but is that really going to find the required improvement for him to go and win Stayers this year? I'm not so sure. I still think that there's something that can come out of left field to shake up the Stayers market. Impaire Pass, I'm not sure anything can get near Constitution Hill, but I certainly wouldn't be convinced that Impaire Pass can't get past State Man given further improvement throughout this season. So if you're throwing him out with the bathwater, I would just urge you to take a note of caution. That concludes the Monday review. If you think I've missed a noteworthy performance from this weekend that should have been mentioned, drop a message to me on X or drop a message in the comments below. As ever, please do hit a subscribe on this if you're not already. The handicap movers and shakers will be coming tomorrow, and I do intend on, between mince pies and opening all my vast presents over Christmas, getting a good bit of content out. So be sure to hit a subscribe so that you don't miss any of that. See you tomorrow for handicap movers and shakers.